Thank you for coming on this Greek Tuesday evening to the Small Parties Question Time. My name's Otto Ingalls, I'm the chairman, and we have three panel members. Anthony Samarov from the Scottish Libertarian Party, who is their spokesman on economics and the author of Universal Basic Income, For and Against. And then we have Richard Lucas, who's the leader of the Scottish Family Party. And we have Dr. Stephen Cowley from For Britain, who is the author of Rational Piety and Social Reform.
Well, my political background is in the SNP, which I joined in 1986 and was in for about 30 years. My main contribution to that was my biography of James Mill, which is, as has been mentioned, who was a Scottish philosopher and political thinker and reformer. I would say I was kind of red-pilled, as the phrase is, on the internet starting around 2011, which made me dissatisfied with essentially the left-wing egalitarian drift of the SNP. So I found a home in For Britain, which is party founded by Anne-Marie Waters after her unsuccessful bid for the leadership of UKIP. And Anne-Marie's the author of Beyond Terror, and she's involved in Sharia Watch, and she has a constitutional project, a British constitutional project that certainly I think the Scottish aspects of need to be developed.
Okay. Forgive me if I just ask you personally a question. Is it not a bit of a switch to being from a Scottish nationalist party to a British party?
Certainly, there are differences. Yeah, one was answerable to people down south, which we never were before, and certainly there's room for development, and I think that'll happen in the future, though it hasn't happened yet.
Okay, right. Richard, do you want to?
Yes, my political history is quite short. I've always been interested in politics, but it's only been the last, I don't know, 5 or a few more years that I've really been heavily involved in it. So when I first decided I wanted to get involved in politics, I thought, right, which party? I'd been involved in the Conservatives when I was younger, but I thought if I join the Conservatives now, with all the public statements I've made and all the things I'm on record saying, I thought there's no point. I'm charging at a brick wall. So there's no point joining the Conservatives, not that I particularly want to in any case. So I thought my last hope of a party that will take me, but without kicking me out, is UKIP. So I joined UKIP, the antidote to political correctness. And didn't quite get kicked out, but it wasn't far off it. I really ran into the same sort of problems I expected in the Conservative Party. So I ended up sort of partyless, wondering what to do. And ended up, myself and some other people, decided that the way forward would be a new party in Scotland, a socially conservative party. We don't use those terms very often, because a lot of people don't understand them. But we are basically a socially conservative party, the Scottish Family Party. A strapline sometimes filling the void in Scottish politics. We think there is a whole range of perfectly sensible opinions and very valid policies that just don't even get discussed in Scottish politics. They're completely off the agenda. And we think the way to fill that void is to unite everyone possible who agrees on those policies in order to get MSPs in the Parliament. So we're neutral on some of the mainstream political issues, like the EU, like Scottish independence, like what should the tax rate be or whatever. So a lot of the usual biggies were neutral in order to be able to bring together the biggest possible coalition of social conservatives. And our hope is that's going to be enough to get MSPs elected on the list into the Scottish Parliament. That's our strategy. So our strategy is very much geared to the Scottish system, because it does give a chance to small parties. If we were in England, then our strategy would be completely hopeless, because you're never going to win a seat with that strategy. But in Scotland, if we can appeal to that 5, 10, 15%, which we believe is there, then hopefully we can see MSPs in the Scottish Parliament. So that's my big project at the moment. I'm working on it full time, have been for over a year, and it's building up nicely. So.
Okay, Anthony, if you would introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hello everyone, a real privilege to have been invited. I'm from the Scottish Libertarian Party. The Libertarian philosophy is very simple. It's sometimes colloquially put as, don't hit people, don't take their stuff. Now that's a moral philosophy that we can practice in day-to-day life. We're all taught it as children. We simply apply those to the political sphere. So the great thing about that, as simple as it sounds to say, is we have a compass on which we base all our philosophy. We believe that only individuals act, and that the government doesn't have a right to do what private individuals do not have the right to do. And so it's really simple. You can follow your self-interest, you can do what you think is right in day-to-day life, as long as you're not interceding in the rights of other people to do the same. But that has great implications when it comes to the role of the state, which we think should be reduced to a minimal role. Thank you.
Okay, well, our panel members have introduced themselves. Could I have the first question, please? Could you give your name first and then your question?
It's John from Maine. I'd like to ask a question for all the panelists that are there. What are all of your thoughts on the increasingly mandatory LGBT and sex education being pushed on younger children by the Scottish Government?
Right, now. Who? Would you like to be first, Stephen, to answer this one?
Yes, in general, I would feel that it's inappropriate to put such a one-sided and arguably mistaken view, on particularly in young children. I find it kind of abusive and worrying that this is being done, other than to a minimum extent amongst adolescents. I think there are different issues. I mean, the gay and the transgender thing, which I think is much more recent. Those are probably issues that should be kept apart. But in general, I find that it's a worry. Although I personally have involvement in the Scottish education system, we do have a member who is, and Richard, obviously to a greater extent. So I'm kind of sympathetic to the Scottish Family Party on that issue.
Anthony, would you like to?
Well, this seems to be a programme that is led by the state that considers itself to be progressive, appealing to certain tendencies that are current in society. People have a right to, two gays have a right to get married. Someone has a right to change their gender if that's what they choose to do. But parents aren't given the option in how to educate their children. And there's too much centralisation in the imposition of the education policy by the state that's rolling this out universally because they think that that's the best way, or claim to think that that's the best way to educate children. So I think the libertarian position would be get it back to the local level, let people make decisions on what should be taught in their schools.
Okay, Richard.
Yeah, I think there's different aspects. The sex education, leaving aside the LGBT, the sex education is just bad advice in lots of ways. It's not the advice that's most likely to lead young people into healthy relationships, healthy, stable family life in the future. So then that's really important. And that's something we try to emphasize, because that's a message that appeals very widely. The LGBT things can be more controversial. But there are not many parents, I think, who send their kids to school thinking, I'm really glad that the teacher's going to be telling them, that porn's great and it's a really good thing. Go ahead, that's just fine. And that's a total disconnect between the education leaders and parents. So I think that's something we're seeking to exploit. The LGBT thing, I think the same question applies. Is this advice that's going to be helpful to people at the stage it is delivered? I think there's good reason to think it isn't the best advice. But the government's approach with a new LGBT inclusive education is to include this content in every subject at every stage from nursery all the way through school. So they're deliberately doing that to take away any chance of opting out. The only way to opt out of it is to keep your kids at home and to school them at home. So again, I think that's very intrusive, it's unnecessary. It's the education system being hijacked by activists, basically. And I sometimes imagine what must it be like being one of these activists, where the government comes to you and says, right, what do you want us to do next? And you tell them they go and do it. Then a few months later, they come and say to you again, right, what do you want us to do next? And then they give money to your organisation. It's a totally different world than our experience. I think the trans thing's very concerning. Again, it's just bad advice. It's a dangerous message that's been delivered to children. So I say it's a child protection issue. We need to protect children from the bad messages that adults are delivering to them. And I think that a majority of parents would not be happy with it. Most of them don't know. They don't realise because the schools don't communicate. But if parents could see the entire curriculum of what their kids were taught, there would be outcry and they wouldn't get away with it. So we're trying to let people know.
Right. Thank you.
Neil Burns in Glasgow. Is the panel aware of the video that went viral of a boy in Aberdeenshire school who got expelled for saying there's two genders? And what do you think? Especially libertarians, what do you think of people being told these dictats?
It sounds like an absolutely outrageous case to me. We've seen an increase in this sort of thing. Tom Laird, the leader of the Scottish Libertarian Party, and I do a show, the Scottish Liberty Podcast, and we covered a story in which someone was even fired from ASDA because of a tweet that he left when he wasn't in work, saying of a comedian saying that some sketch about religion. There seems to be a it was Billy Connolly. There's this creeping, to use the colloquial term, social justice warriorism, which is not just a matter of public choice, but it seems to be creeping into our institutions and sort of being forced as the only acceptable line. And anyone who dares even voice a concern about it, never mind a radically divergent opinion, is basically being castigated and treated like a pariah with no further discussion. So it is a worrying social trend, and yeah, I'm concerned about it as well.
Yeah, I think the issue with Murray up in Aberdeenshire was completely outrageous. That's the one time something got filmed. I mean, that's obviously the tip of the iceberg. I mean, this sort of thing, we hear stories, this sort of thing happening time and time again. Just a bit of inside information on that. You know, he was expelled from school, ultimately, allegedly for filming his teacher against school rules. You don't get expelled for filming your teacher without their consent. That's not the real reason they expelled him. But apparently the decision to expel him was taken from the top at Education Scotland. So that was right from the government education department, basically, made the decision that he should be kicked out of his school for doing that. So it is an outrage. And then we need to fight back against it. With the family party, if I speak to people and say, I think you'd be a really good candidate for the family party, what do you think? Probably 2 out of 3 people will have a reason why there'd be quite a high cost to pay if they were to do that. It's their job, it's the partner's job, it's the course they're doing, it's the organisation they volunteer for, it's the job they might want to do next time or whatever. So the government sort of got its grip on so many aspects of life.
Well, just briefly, I think the family is a kind of social good, and therefore there is a public interest. It's not merely a matter of individual choice, as the libertarians might say. And I think gender roles are a natural part of that. But I think in addition there should be room for sort of subcultures of gay and all this sort of thing. But I think they're kind of subcultures rather than central to a culture.
Okay. Could we have another question, please? Okay.
Yeah, this is more for the four-person.
Well, okay. Could you give me your name?
I'm Ewan Aitchison. Basically, you mentioned that sort of near the end of your sort of introduction that you were keen for maybe four-person to have like a specific agenda or maybe policy package from Scotland. I came to sort of where I am from, I suspect, a similar place to you. I was quite involved with the SNP pretty much up until the 2015 general election. Mm-hmm. And I guess I kind of became red-pilled, as they say on the internet. Mm. But I do realise that I know a lot of people my age who I think might be prepared to jump to sort of similar sort of politics to me, but are sometimes put off by sort of the kind of London-centric politics of a lot of British parties. And I was wondering if there was, when you mentioned sort of a Scottish-specific thing for Britain, what sort of things would be on the agenda?
Well, the problem, I think, is resources to develop it, but certainly we're interested in it. I mean, I think Anne-Marie's concept of a constitution, which is quite good on, but she seems to have the idea of it as a document that gets voted on and therefore acquires some kind of authority. But I think possibly we could broaden the idea of a constitution to be more what it's like. A political constitution is like the constitution of a human body. It's of for example, one would learn about the body from what it does, and one would learn about a political community from its history, essentially. So a part of the Scottish Constitution would be the Declaration of Arbroath that we're celebrating the 700th anniversary of. Part of it would be the works of George Buchanan. Part of it would be the works of Andrew Fletcher. So there would be a way of embodying that in documentary form and embodying it in history and kind of making that part of the foundational documents and part of the political practice of the party as it grows. So, as I say, we don't have the resources for this at the moment, but Anne-Marie is visiting Scotland within the next few weeks, so there's at least an opportunity for discussion there.
Okay. Right. Hopefully you've got a question for all three members of the panel. Sorry.
We can chip on that one if you like.
Well, do you want to...
I just want to mention that I think a constitution is a good idea. The role of a constitution is to protect the people from the government. When you enter into a contract, the stakes should be clearly defined on both sides. It says what you're entitled to and what the other party is entitled to. We're meant to be engaged in a social contract with the government, but we have no idea what our rights are and what our responsibilities are. And we certainly don't know what the inviolable responsibilities of the government are. So how do we know when the government has breached the social contract if we don't have a constitution?
Okay. I was just going to say, in terms of Scottish focus, I think of the Scottish Family Party, we are purely Scottish. So our analysis of Scottish politics, I think, is quite deep, and in some areas, I think it seems like we've got fuller policies than the mainstream Scottish parties have got. We've got a policy booklet at the back. If you want to pick one up on the way out, that's fine. But you can see we've very much got a focus on Scotland and Scottish specific policies.
Right.
Sure.
The gentleman with a magnificent black and green star.
Yellow.
I'll come to the other gentleman afterwards. Okay.
Tom Laird, considering the war on drugs has been raging now for over 50 years, and we seem to be no further forward. In fact, drugs are plentiful and very cheap. There's nobody in this room tonight that didn't want to, couldn't get any drug of choice that they wanted. What do the panel feel, everyone, which should be the step forward? Very costly war on drugs.
Okay, Richard, do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, I would go along with the view that this war on drugs hasn't been fought, really, because there's been a very softly approach from the police in Britain, including in Scotland, for a long time. You say the drugs are freely available, you could go out and get them now. If the police were seriously trying to stop that, that wouldn't be the case. The fact that they are so freely available indicates that there's not really an effort to contain it. I think with drugs, sometimes the simple principle of deterrence is that if you attach a punishment to an action, then people are going to take that into account in their decision making, and they're going to be less likely to take that action. And when it comes to drug abuse and drug dealing, I say that's what we want to do. We want to deter people going down that road. Because I think drugs can't be safe. They can't be a good thing in society, no matter what medium they come through, no matter whether it's legal or not. It's going to destroy lives. Young people's lives particularly are going to be blighted, families, etc., etc. So they're going to do a huge amount of damage in proportion to the amount of use. And I think criminalisation and vigorous policing of it is the route to minimising use. I think, and if you look at countries where they've liberalised, again, I think the picture isn't always as rosy as advocates like to make out. I mean, in the Netherlands, for example, they're seeing cannabis as a serious problem now, and they're tightening up in lots of ways on it. Whereas over here, people tend to think, oh, you know, that's the Dutch utopia, where they're very enlightened and they're on top of these things, and it's not a problem because they're so liberally minded. But I don't think it's that simple. So that's my take.
So just to check, so your position is more money spent and more laws, more stringently sort of enforced.
The law more stringently enforced. Yes. Yeah.
Stephen?
Well, I think it needs to be evidence driven, and I think the principle would be when the drugs affect other people, that's a justification for the authorities to step in. To give an example, in cannabis, it contrasts with alcohol, because alcohol is kind of a simple carbohydrate kind of substance, and the liver breaks it down overnight and you're kind of good to go again. Whereas something like cannabis, the body is less able to deal with it, so it kind of lays down in your fat cells, and then when the fat gets burned off, you get these sort of after effect things. If you're driving a car, that's obviously a danger to other people. I think there are other problems of psychotic and brain development things. So I think there is, in principle, a case for the state to step in, but it essentially has to be evidence driven. So I'm kind of open to evidence.
Anthony, I take it your view is slightly different.
Yeah, I don't approve of people taking drugs, but fundamentally, the costs of the drug war go far beyond the mere money spent on policing it. You're, in some cases, separating a father from a family to put them in jail. They might turn out of jail worse than they came in. They might take notes from someone worse, a more hardened criminal. Criminal behaviour on drugs should be policed against. But fundamentally, an individual has the right to imbibe whatever substances they want, provided they don't cause harm or loss to others when they do so, and that is a fundamental individual right. Due to this illegalization of drugs, we've lost out on 60 or 70 years, maybe more, of research on drugs, how to make them safer, how to reduce the side effects. Not only that, but the clinical use of some of those drugs, for example, there's trials with MDMA on helping in trauma therapy and other things. All of that's been lost to this war on drugs because we've not been looking at the issue correctly. When we talk about deterrence, if someone's, for example, a heroin addict, clearly their impulse control is already compromised because they're willing to risk an overdose. They're willing to risk losing their lives, alienating their family members. So if they don't have the impulse control to be deterred by those possible consequences, what makes one think that they've got the impulse control to be deterred by a prison sentence? I don't think we're looking at the issue rightly. There is an individual rights issue here which is at stake, but also I think a war on drugs has done an immense amount of damage in other ways, been costly, and I'm also not willing to see SWAT teams go into flats and shoot drug dealers dead with the attendant effects of that on the community and everyone in the area being affected by that as well, which would be necessary to put in the sort of draconian authoritarian measures that the family party seems to advocate.
We have another round on that?
We may well come back to that.
Okay.
This is a question where I'd have loved to have been one of the panel members so I could have ripped into people. But
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Frank Russo, and I would just like to thank the panel for being here today. It's kind of relates to the question on drug and everything. Most of the libertarian chat, I'm sorry, I forgot your
Anthony.
Anthony, yeah. Do you not think that libertarianism is generally an outdated idea just because, I mean, in theory, I think it holds up well, but I say that because when it's based on mostly John Locke's ideas, but he wrote this, well, he came up with a philosophy when England was largely a homogenic state and there was no competing multicultural aspects to it. So if we tell, and it seems to be mostly Europeans are who seem to like the idea of libertarianism. I mean, it's not just recent, you can just look at the States, for example, where because European people of that in Britain are told to, well, just be libertarian in a small state, whereas you get people from different cultures that know that in a group they're stronger, and because people in the States get, and here, are on their own essentially, they will turn to drugs, lead to suicide. This is what's happening at the moment. I think in a way it's an outdated idea that could only work, for example, maybe in Japan or Poland.
Right. Okay, Anthony.
Thank you.
Hang on.
Well, I'm not talking about.
Right. Okay. I think we've got a good question. Is libertarianism and are libertarian ideas outdated, Anthony?
On the contrary, I'd say that libertarian ideas have never been so vibrant as they are today. Yes, we do have intellectual ancestors like John Locke and Adam Smith, but their ideas have been refined by philosophers who've improved them and made them more consistent. And really, the philosophy finally came together maybe in the 50s. So I'd say it's more relevant than ever. A greater percentage of people are now libertarians. You mentioned tangentially that people realize that they're in a group, they're stronger. I have no objection to that. Libertarians have no objection to that. But the individual is the basis upon which groups are formed. And as individuals, we can come together and form groups based on shared values or whatever we think benefits us, to create a company, to create a charity, to create organizations. And so libertarians don't deny that as groups we can advocate for our issues more effectively. Certainly not.
Okay, Richard?
Yep, I think with libertarianism, I think it's interesting, there's never, correct me if I'm wrong, it's never really been put into practice in any sort of serious manner. And I think part of the reason for that is it's very theoretical, it's got an intellectual appeal, but when it meets the practicalities and complexities of actually running a country, I think it's quite a different thing. I think it's sort of based on maybe a simplistic view of human nature, treats people as quite one-dimensional, singly motivated individuals, whereas actually, as has been mentioned, people form into groups, people's relationships and other units are very, very important. I think in order to create a successful society, then these group relationships need to be managed as well. And I'm not against a spot of paternalism as well. Like, for example, when the government says I have to wear my seatbelt, I'm quite glad it does that, because if it didn't say that, I might not bother. So I think the government does me a favour by making me do that. So a spot of paternalism is okay. So I'd be interested to hear your line on seatbelts and at some point. Little test case.
You would need a SWAT team to get my youngest to eat his greens.
Just a quick comment on libertarianism. It's, if you look at it, your position is almost identical to anarcho-communists, because essentially you take a Rousseauian view of human nature. You think we're angelic, and the devices will all behave very well. Yet we live in a very complex society, and of course the problem with that is now we depend on technology, which is developed by a handful of
Now, before Anthony responds, it's Stephen's turn.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know if we've got a mobile phone going.
Right. Will someone reach for the hammer, please? Okay, Anthony.
Stephen.
Stephen, sorry, I'm going mad, clearly.
Well, I would come at it with this kind of richer set of concepts in terms of political philosophy. And everyone thinks of a political work not like John Locke, but like Hegel's philosophy of right. I mean, you do have I think essentially the level of property and natural law, which is what libertarians try and construct society out of. But then you kind of move on to other areas, in particular the family, which has a natural structure, and then you look beyond that, you have structures of civil society, which tends to be the trades and the professions. And then beyond that, you have the state, which families and individuals and property holders will make demands of in terms of security. So, for example, you have the military, you have the civil service, you have the judiciary, you have the government, and all these institutions. So I think there's more than libertarianism, or even an exclusive focus on the family, requires to be taken into account, even in terms of one individual state. And then to go on with the Hegelian theme, I think there are other things that impinge on an individual state. I mean, particularly religion, which we haven't discussed, and sort of aesthetic issues in terms of ideas of the good life from novels and from general culture, and such like. So I'm not sure where this came from, but I think we need a richer set of ideas to engage in politics from the standpoint of a statesman or even a churchman. So I would oppose libertarianism on those kind of grounds.
Anthony, can I maybe sort of put something in, which is I keep asking myself, what type of libertarian are you? I mean, who are you who are you and your friends in the Scottish Libertarian Party most influenced by? Are you followers of Ayn Rand, or do you lean more towards the sort of Austrian school of economics, Hayek and Mises?
We're quite ecumenical, but I'd say we're probably quite Austrian. I don't think many anarcho-communists would get on with us. We are strident advocates of free market capitalism, but we also believe in a capitalism that's an even playing field. We don't think the government should be in bed with big business, giving special rights to the big boys as they do. It's true that there's never been a pure libertarian society, but at one time there was never a society that didn't own slaves. That's really neither here and there. We have got gradations of libertarian societies, and wherever we look, the more economically free a society is, the more prosperous it seems to be. So we have serious disputes with the socialists on points of economics. As to the point on human nature, it's really, it's kind of to say that we believe that humans are angelic is completely at odds with the philosophy. We acknowledge that humans are corruptible. That's why we don't want humans to have control over the machinations of the state, to fight their wars abroad and to bribe people into dependency with the welfare state and do all sorts of nefarious things. As an individual, we can act on our own. We can trade with other individuals. We can act in the spirit of friendship. And if we're malevolent, the consequences of our malevolence are limited to a small number of people. But with the power of the state, that's not necessarily the case. So we don't think that people are angelic in human nature. And on the point in the family, if, as you say, it's a natural structure, I'm of that belief myself, then people will default to that natural structure if the state will just stop trying to socially engineer them otherwise, which is why we want to limit the influence of the state in our institutions. Thank you.
Okay.
Yep. Okay.
Well, I think as Stephen, if you like, was the intended victim of the question, he got a sort of extra shot on that one. Okay, other Stephen, you have a question?
Stephen Alexander. My question is, given that across Europe and in the England as well, immigration has become a major concern and caused a lot of social strife, with SNP now moving to increase immigration into Scotland, where do you stand on those matters?
Okay, would you like to start then?
Yes, I think that we would probably distinguish immigration from the Anglosphere from immigration from less compatible cultures. I think what the SNP is doing is kind of accepting the status quo of a low birth rate and using immigration to compensate, which has the effect of creating a multicultural society that people don't necessarily want and don't necessarily understand what the consequences would be. So it seems more sensible to maybe deferring here to encourage family life a bit more and restore the married person's tax allowance and various other measures to have a more sort of stable population.
Okay, right.
Well, in recent years, libertarians have been quite split on the issue of immigration. The position of the party is that migrant workers should be allowed to cross borders just the same way as capitalists can go to whatever country they want in order to take advantage of lower wages. Migrant workers should be able to cross borders to take advantage of higher wages. I would like to see immigration from English-speaking countries like America, Canada, and Australia liberalised. I think we do worry about as Milton Friedman once said, you can't have open borders and a generous welfare state, as that does bias the scales and would encourage people to come and cross borders for the wrong reasons. It's bribing them or encouraging them to come in order to take advantage of welfare, free schools, free healthcare. And there are concerns about that, even within our party. But for the time being, we do take the open borders position.
Okay, Richard.
Yeah, I would say there are some benefits from immigration. I think sometimes they're overplayed by proponents of it, but there are some benefits. There are also some potential problems as well. So it depends on the amount and the nature of it. I think they're the really important questions. It's not about a headline figure. There's a lot of other relevant factors as well. Stephen mentioned cultural distance. I think that's a very significant factor, very definitely. What tends to happen with immigration? If you say you've got a little town, the first couple who move there from a new country, then they integrate completely. They've got to learn the language. And people quite like having someone a bit different, brightens the place up, and that's quite good. Everything's perfect. But if then a relative comes over and joins them, so that's still great, but maybe there might be a slightly less integration. And then more people are thinking, right, shall we go over and move to that town? Well, they'll think, well, yeah, we'd already know people there. There'll already be people who speak our language. And people will start then moving to a country without really the intention of integrating. So if you allow large communities, so isolated communities to grow, immigration into them will accelerate and accelerate because the cultural barrier seems to be very low. And I think that's what's happened in some areas of England, and I think that creates problems, it creates tensions. And I think if Scotland could avoid those sort of issues in the future, then that would be a wise move. So I think assimilation is really important, and I think at the moment, sort of a bit of a pause to have a few decades to let things settle down and to allow assimilation and integration to take its course. But this is not a fast process. This is a multi-generational process in many cases. So that needs to be allowed to happen. And just to echo what Stephen said about birth rates, okay, the assumption is, you hear Nicola Sturgeon talking, the only way to deal with a falling population is mass immigration. No consideration of abortion, which currently more than bridges the gap between the number of births and deaths in Scotland, and encouraging family size, which government policy could definitely do.
Okay, thank you. Could we have another question, please? Okay, this time though, if you could give us your name, sir.
Okay, my name's Neil. I guess I've got a rather odd political background because I've probably been back in the day more involved, let's say, on the left, anti-war protests and things like that. It's only recently that I began to feel like to look at very rapid sort of cultural changes we're seeing happen. I think that's as I was trying to say in the sort of the previous brief sort of interjection, related to sort of technological changes.
Okay.
And so I think a lot of the changes we're seeing around, if you like, mass migration, that's one issue. The role of the family, that's another issue, okay? They're all related to technological changes. And we're seeing more and more power invested in, if you like, big sort of multinationals and the state. And often it's not just our local nation state. And so one big issue is, you know, the future of the nation state, because there's certainly intellectuals in many, if you like, sort of international institutions who really see the nation state as a thing of the past. And, you know, my brother, for example, was an advisor to Tony Blair back in the sort of and just in passing and conversation, you know, we were talking about sort of immigration, and at that stage my views on it were beginning to change, because, you know, I was just saying, you know, it has to be regulated, it has to be managed, and you're not managing it, okay? And that was just the issue was the whether they should have, you know, let Poles come in 7 or 9 years earlier than they had to extend, freedom of movement to the new Eastern European countries over that. And he says, well, I think nation states are a thing of the past.
So perhaps...
And that was really an insight into where they're coming from. Now, the basic question is, there's a huge void in Scottish politics. Basically, the only issue the main parties really disagree on is the constitutional issue. If you look at, you know, the SNP, Labour, even the Conservatives, I mean, really, they don't really disagree on the fundamentals. But the problem, if I look at, let's say, the Scottish family...
Can I take from you two questions, maybe? The first one, which is, you mentioned the question of whether the nation state is a thing of the past. That in itself makes an excellent question. Right. And the second question that's coming out of what you're saying is there a void in Scottish politics?
Because the Scottish Family Party seems to be more focused on the issue of the family. And I think we need, if you like, a party, an opposition, if you like, in Scotland that has, if you like, a clear vision of an alternative, you know, a clear vision of an alternative that goes beyond just looking at an aspect of the family, which is one aspect.
So perhaps the second question would be, how do you fill the void? You perceive as a void.
What, you know, for example, I've seen Richard saying his videos, which I would agree with 100% about family being, you know, essential to our society. And I think the moves basically against the family are technocratic. You know, they're basically placing more power in the state, and that it enables more surveillance. Okay, because the weaker family.
Right. Okay, I'm going to cut you off because you've now getting to the point where I've got at least 3 questions out of you.
So nation states. So do you think nation states?
Do you think the nation state is a thing of the past, Richard?
Definitely not. I think people's, a lot of this is emotional and subjective. People's subjective allegiance, sense of community, sense of sort of harmony and responsibility to other people is to the nation state. Now in Scotland, if only that were a simple issue, then I would be a straightforward patriot. But in Scotland, it's quite difficult to be a straightforward patriot because the vision of nationhood is divided, it's splintered in Scotland, so that makes it quite difficult. So if Scotland became an independent nation, then on the first day after that, I would be a patriotic Scot, and I'd be arguing for a strong Scottish national identity and unity of the nation. In the meantime, I'm a unionist, so I prefer that to be as it is. It's a patriotism for the current arrangement. As the family party, we decided that if you get into this issue, then we'd be slicing our potential support in half. And we thought we can't afford to do that. If you look at the social conservative vote, if you like, if you slice that in half, there's no MSPs on the horizon. So the only way to get this social conservative voice in is if people with their second vote are willing to put aside these other issues and think it's important to have these things represented. Because the Scottish Family Party, we're not claiming to have like the full package to run the country. Like if we won the election and were suddenly in the government, we'd be thinking, we've got no policies on loads of things, what do we do? But we think that then our mission is to put in a different voice into the Parliament, which would influence the whole debate in the nation. It would be very important. The main thing I would say that there with Scottish nationalism and unionism, it is ultimately just a subjective thing. Whether you're a Scottish nationalist or unionist is determined almost exclusively by your upbringing and experiences that have led you to that subjective loyalty at that point. So I think arguing about it in the political realm is a bit futile, which is why we want to move things on from it.
Okay, Stephen.
Well, no, I think the question is began talking about technology, but I think politicians of the previous and I think the elected politicians of the current generation, they seem to operate with a kind of blank slate view of human nature, which I think is at odds with the facts of the matter. If you look at Frank Salter's work on ethnogenetic interests, there are kind of negative effects of having people from different ethnic groups competing for resources within the same area. There tends to be a breakdown of social trust. Another thing is because people are different, you tend to get stratified societies, and there's kind of resentment from an ethnic underclass, and that tends to lead to sort of ideologies that justify that kind of resentment. So it's not a happy situation. So I'd be against the open borders thing for that reason. I think all of the parties around the table have some way to go. I mean, I think all of us have some electoral experience. Richard and Lochaber for Britain stood in the Leith Walk by-election, as did the Scottish Libertarians. Certainly, I think we have things to learn in terms of practical politicking. Certainly, we need to do more than sort of leafleting. There needs to be more community involvement, I would suspect, to bump up our vote. But people kind of know we exist, but there's certainly a long way to go to establish an alternative party.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, I don't think the nation state is going anywhere anytime soon, but I think the question, like the question in immigration, points at a more important point, which is that we want to live in a cohesive society. And I think it really gets right to the heart of the problem and why libertarianism is necessary, because if you look at what's basically happening, as you said, group identities are subjective. Some people here feel like proud Scots. Others feel they identify more with Britishness. But what we have is a war of all against all, where everyone is trying to force their way of life by means of the state on everyone else. And that's at the heart of why libertarianism is needed, really. What we're saying is, you have your way of life, we have our way of life, and as long as we respect each other's rights, we each have our own choice. In our own party, we had a debate over whether we should take Richard's position, and we came down on the Scottish nationalist position. If, when you went to vote for Brexit, or you didn't, you had the choice to have EU citizenship, and if you didn't take it, then you'd have to wait at the long queue in the airport. We wouldn't have seen such a breakdown of social cohesion over these issues, the same way that in America they have over Trump. People hate each other, and they hate each other because we are not able to say, you have your way of life, we have our way of life. Let's not ram it down each other's throats.
Neil, Neil, I don't think we've really got to grips fully with what you were saying. Perhaps the tech issue. You were talking about large corporations.
For example, in the news today, we know there's been the government have let away the Chinese tech giant Huawei installed 5G network around the UK. Which includes Scotland for the time being. Okay? And that's going to have huge ramifications. So we're seeing actually big states and big business merge. So basically, if you, let's say, have a libertarian view where you think that, you know, we can somehow, as individuals, if you like, regulate all these big businesses that are, you know, controlling our lives in different ways. I mean, most people's lives, many people's lives, I mean, they are literally, you know, they're jumping from one institution to another institution. You know, it might be Tesco, it might be the institution, it might be, you know, Google, it might be, you know, Facebook.
Okay.
And these are more powerful than states.
Shall we throw to the panel that
States, you know.
right? Are the big corporations more powerful than states? Do you think that something should be done about it? Okay, Anthony, do you want to go first on this one?
Well, the thing is, the state is the only institution that can forcibly transfer your resources and give it to a corporation. Otherwise, Coca-Cola would be lobbying Microsoft, and Microsoft would be lobbying Starbucks. Mm-hmm. So no handouts to big business. Even the idea of a corporation is a privilege that the government grants to a company, which says that if you're in a corporation and you do something illegal or you cause harm or loss to someone, you're not personally responsible. The corporation gets sued instead of you personally. This is just a hand puppet to protect the rich and powerful. It's not in the interests of most of us as individuals. So I would say limit the state's role in the economy to a referee. It should not be picking winners and losers, but it should simply be instituting the law to make sure that corporations don't cause harm or loss to citizens.
Can I just quickly jump in there? The problem is that now we're seeing regulation in terms of censorship, not just from state actors, okay, and also if it comes from state actors, that's bad, you know. But we're actually seeing the big tech giants in the United States, where they've got their First Amendment on free speech, okay. We're seeing organisations like Google and you know, Twitter regulating individuals and censoring you know, opinions, you know. And that's so. Why are we letting Google, you know, control our lives?
Yeah. Google got 650 million in handouts for the US government. Would it have a monopoly otherwise? I don't know. The line between what is the state and what is a corporation has been blurred in these cases. Corporations writing regulations is nothing new. That's why they have lobbyists. The healthcare industry writes regulations on pharmaceuticals. The banking industry writes regulations for the banking sector, or people from there do. So we are deeply interested in removing the coercive force, the coercive influence of corporations on the economy, which they can only carry out via the government. If you disallow the government from picking winners and losers, there will be no interests for corporations to lobby in order to impose their will upon the rest of us by force.
Okay, Richard.
Okay, it's picking up what Anthony said. He said companies can go about the business as long as they're not causing any harm to anyone. I suggest often the interpretation of that can be quite short-term and individualistic. I think there can be harm to a society in lots of different ways. So like a company that sets up selling chocolate, does it harm people? You could argue that it does. So I don't think there's a simple matter of principle that determines how we deal with these issues. It needs to be a pragmatic, case-by-case issue.
You're not forced to buy the chocolate.
Sorry?
You're not forced to buy them.
No, I'm not saying anything should be done about them. It's just saying it meets Anthony's definition of a company that could be seen as causing harm in society. So I wouldn't take say I've got a principle that settles all the issues, but I'd look case by case. And there are a lot of areas where I think it's right for the governments to moderate the activities of businesses. On the other hand, I think a free market economy is the most effective in generating wealth, and that's a really important thing for a nation. In terms of their influence, I think we're in new territory here with the social media companies exerting huge influence, censorship, etc. I sometimes wonder why they do it. Is it because they really believe those things? Or is it because they're trying to keep the sort of globalist anti-capitalists off their back? Because these are some of the biggest, most successful American multinational companies in the world. So they should have Extinction Rebellion smashing their windows. But they'll think, well, we can keep them at bay if we just do enough LGBT, feminist, if we just do all the other PC things, maybe they'll let us off with making a fortune as a multinational American corporation. So I think there's a bit of that in it. I think the legal case is currently against YouTube and Google about are they a publisher or are they, is it a media company? Is that the alternative?
Is it a platform?
A platform, yeah. I think that needs to be resolved one way or another, because at the moment these companies are so influential, and I think their attempts to skew political debate are quite sinister. So I think the government needs to step in order to preserve an open democratic society that's endangered by these hugely influential companies skewing public debate.
Okay. Stephen?
Briefly, I would say that companies typically act within the law, and they're weaker than they lobby, but they're weaker than governments, and are aware of that fact. I think, in a way, the example that's given is more interesting, or supervenes upon the general point in terms of the control of the internet that's been established since 2016, since Trump's election, and we've seen a kind of vociferation of it, with the Chinese having their separate internet now, and a lot of national censorship creeping in, and a lot of effort being put into search engine manipulations. So my feeling was, when the internet was free and available to everyone, that was a much better situation. I found myself learning all sorts of things that I would possibly find it more difficult to learn now. So I think that's actually been led by politicians. It's people like Merkel and so on that have taken the initiative to stifle Google. So certainly, I thought the internet was much better when it was free and open. There were disadvantages in terms of abuse and such like, but there were advantages too.
Okay, the very patient chap over there.
Can I hear the panel's view on the fact that most demographers project that white Brits will be a minority in this country by 2066? Can I hear each of yours take on that, and how it affects your respective worldviews, your point of view? And please stay on the point.
Okay, right. Do you fancy starting that one, Stephen?
It worries me greatly. I mean, the meaning of my life, in a sense, is to engage with the culture that I inherited, and if it's not to be passed on, it kind of destroys the meaning. And I think I feel that in a particular sense through literature, but I think it's a common feeling, so I would not allow that to happen if it can be prevented. I think people do tend to project demography into the future, assuming nothing's going to change, but of course things can change socially, they can change politically. But it's the job of activists to contribute to that and make it happen.
Okay, Stephen.
Anthony. All right.
Sorry, Anthony. Right. Okay, Anthony.
I don't know if the party has a position on it. I've not seen the research, and I've not seen the counter arguments to it. Personally, I think that our liberal, to an extent, people do come here because they think that it offers a better way of life than wherever they came from, and to the degree that is because they're, say, migrant workers, rather than that the system that we have incentivizes them to come here, that should be successful. I would like to see the system stop incentivizing people to come here, because I think to a degree, we have to have the faith in our values and our culture that we've shown to be a culture that creates vast amount of wealth, and do all that we can as individuals, you know, as we do with our show, educating people on these topics, what the West has achieved, what Britain has achieved in terms of advancement in technology, creating incredible wealth and things like that, and do all we can as individuals to demonstrate that these ideas are excellent ideas, and that if people come here, we should be encouraging them to know what our ideas have done, how they've created Western civilization. And I do have a problem with the way the education system promotes a view of history that seems to suggest that the government came along and fixed everything, when actually, if you look at most of it, it was individuals, it was the free market, it was innovators, entrepreneurs that created the fantastic success which we now take for granted.
Okay, Richard.
Yep. I think the really important thing with this issue is we're going to start off accepting where we are. Now, it may be that you're someone who thinks they're really delighted with the amount of immigration over recent decades, or maybe you're someone who thinks there's been far too much. But the fact is, we are where we are. So if people start going down the line of, right, I don't like there being so many immigrants here, even if they're citizens or whatever, what can we do about it? How can we get rid of them? How can we get them to... As soon as you start thinking down those lines, you're falling off the end of the spectrum. It's completely unrealistic. It's never going to happen. It would be completely unfair to try and make that happen. So then that's a path that's completely destructive. The question was phrased in terms of race. I think people sometimes see race as a proxy for culture. If you've got people of a different race, then they're probably of a different culture. And I think if people see an increasing number of people from other cultures, that would likely go with a weakened sense of rootedness, a weakened sense of national identity. And I think they're rational concerns, and that's perfectly reasonable to have those. But they're concerns that can be addressed through aiming at integration and assimilation. Give it time and make a conscious effort at it, like, for example, the way the USA does. Then I think you can forge a united nation out of that. The problem with framing the issue as primarily about race is that, in a sense, is hopeless, because there's no solution to that. Those people are not going to change race. So your only solutions are completely unacceptable, which is why I think bringing in race into politics is potentially dangerous. Whereas if you see them in terms of culture and assimilation, a united society, etc., then that's things you can work on, and you can be optimistic, and you can restrict immigration in the meantime, but you can work on it and you can have a positive vision of the future, which I think is really the only option for us.
Yeah.
The lady in the back row.
Most immigrants don't assimilate our way. They bring their own cultures with them, and they don't have to.
I think I would possibly comment on what Richard's just said, that he says that it seems to, I'm not sure what he's saying, that it's unrealistic or that there's nothing that can be done about it. But I think the current situation was kind of brought about deliberately, specifically by the 1948 Citizenship Act, and it's evolved happily enough for a first generation. I think there's negative effects being seen, but now that we're getting almost 70 years past it. So I mean, it's been brought about deliberately, and I think people have come here and invested in our society, and we do have to appreciate that. But if it's been brought about deliberately, it can be changed deliberately, not quickly, but the direction over a couple of generations can be put back to where we want it to be.
So how would that happen? You mean people living here would move, would leave the country, or?
Some would.
But by what means?
They would want to return. There would be a variety of methods.
But we'd assume that that's not going to happen, because it's not happening at the moment. So there's no reason to expect that will happen without some sort of incentive or some sort of policy to induce that.
Or maybe stop promoting the opposite. If there is a problem with immigrant assimilation, I think it's largely a problem caused by the welfare state. If you pay people to do exactly what they're doing, then they'll continue to do that. And I think it's a sad thing in this country if we have ghettoized communities where people of us that all came from another country just live together and don't speak English. People are afraid to go there and things like that. But not that I'm saying there ought to be one. There has been no integration policy, but there has been government funding of the opposite of integration, and I think that that's a problem. I'm just back from New York, where one of the things I loved about it was how cosmopolitan it was. But even though there was different cultures within New York, they shared a common culture, and I think it shouldn't be controversial to say that I think that's a good vision to have for a country or a city or any place where people gather together, that they have their own individuality and their own culture, but they also form a culture together and institutions.
Okay, the chap over there.
Just a question for Richard, and there's no solution. Would our solution not be to incentivize them to, well, instead of investing in integrating them, maybe investing in their countries? Because, I mean, I like speaking to people about this, and not just different races, but from anywhere, and they say they're largely here for the money. If they had enough money to go back, or companies to go back, they would go back. They say that the weather's crap, so, and that's just one of the problems. Like, I'm not even Scottish, but I like it here, so I stay and I integrate. But some don't, and just look at Malmo in Sweden is rich, but they say, oh, we want to go back to Syria. Well, not all of them, but a lot say, well, we would go back if we had money, so they're not a solution to invest in their countries.
Yeah, I heard of something recently. It was a really surprising story. I think it was Denmark is offering to pay refugees to go back. I think it's offering something like 20,000 euros or something to go, and they can change their mind. They can go back, and within a year they can change their mind and go back to Denmark. So they are offering an incentive. I think when you're dealing with refugees, then I think a country accepting refugees, that's a different matter. When the danger's passed, then I think it's reasonable for a country to say, you can come and stay for the duration of the danger, but then we'd like you to go back in. I think that's perfectly reasonable. For people who are settled here and have got citizenship, I think to even suggest that there's an intention to incentivize them leaving the country, I think that's not a moral option to even suggest that to people who are citizens. Because I think once you've crossed that boundary, you may believe that the nation's made terrible mistakes in the past in allowing so many people to come and become citizens, but then once they are, you've got to treat them fairly and find a way forward rather than go back to that. That's my view very strongly. The other thing with that, if you imagine that you were let's say you're Pakistani, say, and the government offers an incentive for anyone of Pakistani ancestry to go back to Pakistan, the message delivered inevitably is, we'd be quite keen to get rid of you. So if you wouldn't mind considering it, it can't be avoided that you're delivering that message. And if you want assimilation and harmony, I don't think that's the way to get it.
Stephen, hopefully not on immigration.
Yeah, no, I've got a different question for you.
Good.
Given that areas in the country are getting quite badly affected by crime, and that currently the police only deal with, I think, 7% of crimes, how would you foresee an improvement in the law enforcement in the country?
Okay, Richard, I think you go first this time.
Yeah, I mean, crime in general, a lot of it is linked to family breakdown. The statistics, like, for example, the number of male prisoners who are brought up in a fatherless home. I mean, there's various statistics, but it's like well over half. I mean, it's ludicrously overrepresented. So that's an area where I think you'd have a huge impact at minimal cost. If you could promote family stability, then the knock-on effects would be huge, potentially. I think through education at the moment, young people are not being taught the self-discipline that they need. So when they're in situations where they encounter authority figures or whatever, or they hear what the rule is, they're more likely to think, oh, well, stuff it. I'm going to do it in any case, or why should I do what you say? Why should I follow that law? So I think we're priming generations who are more likely to get into trouble with the law. Drugs were mentioned earlier on. That's a big factor in crime. We've got different solutions to it, but I think trying to tackle that one way or another. I think alcohol as well. I heard the statistics, something like 60% of prisoners were under the influence of alcohol when they committed their crime. So that's a pretty huge factor as well. So getting over a message of responsibility with alcohol, I think, is very important as well. And I think it needs a bit of cultural leadership there. And basically to say that, you know, being drunk is not okay, because these are the things it leads to. This is the way it endangers other people. So this is not something that's not socially acceptable anymore. In terms of the police is politicised, social workers in uniform, as Otto calls them. So they're getting the police back to doing their job and being a police force with authority and the manpower, the equipment, and the authority to do their job. At the moment, I'm sure as a policeman, you're terrified that someone's going to complain about you, or they're going to sue you, or whatever. You're probably feeling like you're on tiptoes all the time. So that needs to change. It needs to be the criminals who are feeling like, you know, they have to be on tiptoes when they encounter the policeman. So I want to shift the balance of power back to the police. Right.
Okay, Stephen.
I would mostly second that. I mean, one thing we've observed is police activity concerning the internet, which so-called hate crimes. We wouldn't advocate prioritising that. We would want more real-world stuff. I think there are general cultural factors that the religion that Richard said. One would be the decline of religion. I think when one has domestic incidents, the police get called now, but I mean in previous generations it would be a priest, it would be a minister who would possibly settle things better by telling people, reminding people of why they got married in the first place and this sort of thing. But certainly there are a variety of cultural factors and maybe additional resources would be appropriate.
Thank you.
Okay, Anthony.
So, there's two issues here. Alluded to are the sociological contexts, and those are things that should be dealt with. In terms of enforcement, I believe last time I looked at the figures, the crime rates have been going down for quite a considerable amount of time, at least violent crimes. Yeah, the police shouldn't be focused on online hate crimes or prosecuting the drug war. But when you speak about the relationship of the individual to an authority figure, all authority should be earned. And if it's true that what you're saying is that the police are only dealing with 7% of crimes, then that's a serious breach of the social contract. If the state has one role, it's to prosecute and protect us from criminals. Surely, that's the primary role of the state. So something needs to be done about the attitude of the state towards what its role in our lives is, and that it should get its priorities straight and be dealing with and prosecuting criminals, and also looking into deterrence and what that would entail. What are the sociological factors that are creating crime so that it can be deterred? Because it's better to stop it from happening in the first place than to have to spend massive amounts of resources chasing up antisocial people.
Okay, the gentleman at the front.
I think I've got a related question. I'm Gary Pratt. What would the panel's views be on the grooming gang scandals that have been going on around Britain, where the police have literally stood by and allowed young British girls, some really young, to be raped, and the only reason they didn't step in was because they were accused of, they were worried about being called racist.
Okay, Anthony, do you want to take up the issue of grooming gang scandals and the behaviour of the state?
It's outrageous. If someone commits a crime, it's equality by the law, they should be prosecuted. It doesn't matter if they're a politician or an immigrant. That should be the primary function of the state. I don't know if this is some kind of thing to ferment division in society by getting the nationalists, oh my God, we've got these immigrants coming here and being allowed to rape people, and on the other hand, the left being crazy about racism and things like that. But it definitely smells funny. And yeah, definitely anyone who commits a rape should be prosecuted.
Sorry, what do you mean it smells funny? I'm not
What
clear.
I just mean is, I don't want to go into conspiracy theory territory, but the state stands to gain from social problems, because the more social problems there are, the more we turn to the state as our protector. So whether it's poverty...
Have they not made enough social problems already?
They certainly have. And I'm not really sure that gaining access to the ring of power from the Lord of the Rings is going to corrupt the wearer, or if you'll be able to wield that power. We need the power, but just it's us who has to have the power. But I fear that I stray off topic. So
okay, Richard.
Yeah, I think it's completely outrageous that the police didn't act as they should have done. That just shows how far gone the police are in some cases. They're so stuffed full of equality and diversity training that they can't state the obvious and just perform the most basic functions of their job. So I think that's obviously outrageous that happened. I would hope that that lesson has been learned once and for all. You would hope that that's happened. In terms of what was going on, I mean, this was mainly sort of Pakistani Muslims. I don't know how devout Muslims there were. So I think that's something that needs looking at, and that needs investigating to try and understand why that's happened. Why was that mindset there among those people? I don't know if that's a cultural thing from Pakistan. I don't know if it's some interpretation of Islam. I have no idea. But I think the British government needs to be finding out, and that needs to be a top priority. And as far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be a particularly great effort being made to do that. I don't know if there is some sort of inquiry going on, but I'd say there needs to be. Until someone can explain to me why it has been people from this particular demographic, I will think, well, they should be on the case, still trying to find out why that's happening. Because until you identified the thinking behind that, whatever influence it is that's led to that, then you can't try and tackle it. So they've got to get to the bottom of it. On the other hand, the one thing I would say, for some people, if your agenda is very much sort of anti-Islam, for various reasons, I think that, there's various rational concerns about Islam. For some people whose agenda is very much anti-Islam, then this is ammunition for them. And they bring it up again and again and again, claiming it's out of concern for the victims, whereas if there was a different demographic involved, they wouldn't be concerned with the issue at all. So I think if that's the case, I think there's something going a bit wrong there as well. But yeah, we certainly need to get to the bottom of why it's happened to try and tackle the attitudes that led to it.
Okay, Stephen.
Well, I think one particular thing is, a lot of us thought it was dealt with when the J report came out, which was two or more years ago, but we've seen it breaking out again in Manchester, so it seems to be perhaps maybe more of a systemic problem than has been recognised thus far. Certainly, I think there are cultural things, and it's kind of, as far as one can tell, there's this kind of borderline of race, and people will tend to be less thoughtful, careful about members of an ethnic outgroup than of their own group. As has been mentioned, maybe there is a problem with Islam, which is an ideology that can be utilised to mobilise energies against an outgroup. There are aspects of the Hadith and the Quran that would justify that, but I think probably dislike of an ethnic outgroup, which is a kind of human universal, is also something that's at work. Certainly, it ought to be prioritised, and we should keep on it.
Okay.
Keep at the authorities, I mean.
Right.
Could we ask questions?
Well, I've got two members of the you get to speak. I've got two members of the audience who are keen to ask questions. Quite quickly, the lady there.
Yeah, I've noticed that the Scottish police have found a large-scale grooming gang, but they've kept it a secret.
It was reported in today's Scottish Sun 3 years after they did investigate the case, and people, I believe, were prosecuted, but they didn't tell the people of Scotland about it for 3 years. Okay, the gentleman over there.
Neil Burns, should the BBC licence fee be abolished?
Oh, excellent. A question we can get simple, honest answers on. Okay, Stephen first. BBC licence fee.
I think there is a case for public service broadcasting. Personally, I'm not happy with the service we get from the BBC. It tends to exclude our point of view from legitimate debate. There are a lot of the BBC operate through National Union of Journalists guidelines, which are at best to report what a party like ours would say, but never in a positive light. And if there's anything negative to be said, to go all in for it. The licence fee wouldn't necessarily be a matter of principle, but the way it's spent, I think, could be changed. But with reference to the NUJ guidelines in particular, which the journalists operate under. So,
are you open to the idea then of abolishing the licence fee?
I think there can be a public interest, so I wouldn't entirely abolish it. Perhaps it could be. It would be a shot across their bows if it was reduced, or at least not increased.
Okay, Anthony?
Yes. If you have a desirable service, you don't have to force people at gunpoint to pay for it through the tax system, so it should be abolished.
Richard?
Family party policy is to abolish the licence fee. Again, I'm drawn to the idea of a national broadcaster. I can see a value in that, but I just see it as beyond repair. I don't think it can be redeemed and brought to any semblance of neutrality. And I think its influence is insidious, because in Britain, with broadcast media, you have to be neutral. You can't have a licence to set up like a Fox News in the UK. You have to be neutral. And the definition of neutral is taken roughly to mean you've got to be like the BBC. So it skews the whole of broadcast media to the left liberal end of the spectrum. So I think it needs to go. I think producing British-centred, Scottish-centred material programming that helps unite the nation, national identity, etc. I think that's very positive. But I do think there would be a market for that. I think in an open market, like if you look at The Crown, for example, massive hit. I think there still would be programmes like that produced. And with the BBC licence fee, I always like to think about it this way. Let's imagine you came across a country where the law was you were only allowed to buy a newspaper if you also bought the government's newspaper along with it. What would we think of that? We'd think this is tyranny, and yet that's exactly the system we've got with the BBC.
Okay, Tom.
Yeah, given that Donald Trump wants NATO members to contribute more, usually financially more to NATO, should Britain contribute more, and should a possible independent Scotland remain part of NATO?
Okay, Richard.
Position on NATO. I think the 2% is the agreement in NATO, and I'm definitely with Donald Trump when he says it's just not fair that countries don't bother building up their own armed forces and just relying on America. I mean, that is just, it's not on. That's not sustainable long term. So then Britain should at least meet its 2%, and I think strong armed forces are very important. We don't have a family party policy because that's a reserved matter. But my personal view is I would be wanting to build up the armed forces in very substantially. Just going back to independent Scotland and NATO, if it wasn't, it would be very vulnerable. But would it want to? Would it be willing to spend 2% on defence? I don't know, but I think it ought to try and join NATO if it happens.
Okay, Stephen?
I think in general terms, there's the fundamental decision to be taken in defence is between a standing army and a militia, and although it's a matter of principle and there would be problems with it, I think possibly to bring some kind of militia back would be an appropriate thing to review, though certainly it would be a major decision and we would want to take it immediately. Broadly, we would be happy with NATO. We're not so happy with the what seems to be a kind of continuation of the Cold War, which seems kind of unnecessary since the collapse of the Soviet Union. We would question the effectiveness of Britain's involvement in the Middle East based on what seems to be naive misunderstandings of political Islam. I don't think that's money well spent. But we favour a military in some form, though we would review what form it took.
Anthony?
NATO is an organisation that was created during the Cold War, and partly to ensure that if there was going to be a nuclear strike from the Soviet side, that it would happen in Europe rather than in America. They used to run all these exercises where countries like Germany would back out of the exercise in disgust because of the strategies that America was imposing upon what would happen if they do this, what would happen if they do that. After the Berlin Wall came down, there was talks in good faith with the Russians when the America basically agreed to halt expansion of NATO, and then they went right on ahead and started courting Eastern Bloc countries to join NATO. It's an outdated institution, but not only that, as long as NATO exists, there's people there drawing an income from going around picking fights. We should get out of NATO, and the strategy of a country should be to ensure that our military is such that if anyone was to attack us or our interests, they'd know they stood to gain less from doing so than they could possibly gain from it. It's much more cost effective to fight a defensive war than an offensive one, and we should be looking towards peace and free trade with all nations.
Okay.
Can I just point to something that Richard said there?
Okay.
The last time UK armed forces were involved in any action that could be described as offensive was the Falklands War. And even that's debatable as to whether you could come to some sort of arrangement with Argentina or the stewardship of the Falkland Islands. Okay? The last time for a war that was generally defensive was, of course, the Second World War. If you look after the last 30, 40 years, then what we call our armed forces have literally been involved in destabilising other countries and actually making the world a lot more dangerous. And if you think about it, who would invade Scotland? Who would be motivated to invade Scotland? Because these days you don't need to invade countries, you just buy them up. China doesn't need to invade Britain, you can just buy it. Russia doesn't need to invade Britain. It's, you know, I can't remember how many times the size of it, but it's like it's going to be something like over 50 times the size of the British Isles. Okay, they would have no reason to. They could just buy influence if they really wanted to.
Yeah,
there's no need to invade it. It's not like
they probably would need to invade. They couldn't afford it.
Yeah, the thing with modern military, like the Second World War, war breaks out, we're ill prepared. Let's convert all the factories to make Spitfires and tanks and whatever. And you can do that. You just can't do that anymore. Modern military technology, you can't do it once the war started, or once you've got like a few months' notice. There's nothing you can do. So you need to be, I think, in a greater state of preparedness for decades ahead, because there's no catching up in warfare.
I'm not saying that I think the country has a right to self-defense. I mean, the only area of the world that probably would invade parts of Europe would be the Middle East. But that is partly destabilised by, you know, sort of our sort of military adventurism in that region, you know. So I mean, I think that when we look at the whole defence question is we're going to look at what the British Armed Forces have actually been doing over the last 30, 40 years, which is certainly not defending Britain.
Okay, right. Panel members, do you think that the record of the British Armed Forces over the last 30 or 40 years has been a good one, so-so, or a bad one? And Anthony?
It's been outrageous. And it touches upon concerns about immigration as well, bombing countries, and then having to that have been raised at this evening.
Okay, Richard.
Two ways of taking the question. In terms of how they've performed doing their job, I think they've been very good. Not perfect, but very good. In terms of the overall influence on the world, I would see it as positive. I think there's often difficult decisions to be made and mistakes are made. But overall, I think Britain and America, the Western allies, have been an influence for good in the world. I think that's why we've had a sustained, all we've got to remember is we've had a sustained period of peace. And I think a big reason for that's been the military strength of America, that hasn't got territorial ambitions, that is basically more or less keeping the peace. And I think Britain's been helping with that in many cases as well.
Okay, Stephen.
I think the British Armed Services have an excellent record internationally in terms of sticking to their rules of engagement and as professional soldiers. That's something we would want to maintain. I think possibly we have to extend the concept of war that we're using, because what we seem to be thinking of is kind of kinetic warfare, tanks and planes and this sort of thing. But when you're facing an ideological threat, it's something much broader. I mean, one can think of two examples. One would be communism, where the agenda is to destabilize a society and create a revolutionary situation, and that is a kind of aggression, but ideological rather than physical. And of course, we're dealing with resurgent political Islam at the moment, particularly through the Muslim Brotherhood, and there is a whole Quranic doctrine of war, of jihad, and it's something that soldiers, top brass, so to speak, need to be aware of. And I don't think, particularly in dealing with the Middle East, when they're happy to impose Sharia law as part of the constitution of Iraq, for example, I don't think that shows that's more a question of military intelligence, and I think there's a lack there.
Right, chap in the back row.
Yeah, just on global warming, which could be discussed, is it? I think personally it's up for debate whether it's totally man-made or is it something that there are just both through cycles. But just a question to the panel. Is throwing money at it like Macron would do, because his idea would be tax workers who commute, is that a good idea, or is there a more viable idea? Just a general question.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you brought up, actually, because it's quite a subject that's involved in a lot of areas of policy. Okay, Stephen, first, on global warming and spending money on combating it, what are your and your party's views?
Well, we would continue to review the evidence. I think it's important to realise that European countries and Canada have been quite good at this, whereas the industrialising nations, particularly India and China and Africa, where there's a major sort of causal factor in terms of the demographic explosion, they are also things that need to be looked at internationally. My overall feeling is that there's probably some kind of scare elements and looking at unreliable multi-factor projections, but there appears at least to be some basis, and that would justify expenditure.
Anthony.
It's a complicated issue. I'm always sceptical when the only solutions to a problem ever promoted are let the government control you more or let the government tax you more. So, especially when those who are, those in this particular field of study, those who gain grants and things like that are those who come down on the official line. That doesn't mean that global warming necessarily isn't true, or that it isn't man-made, but if it is, we need the resources, the growth that we get from being able to burn fossil fuels in order to have the wealth to combat the consequences of global warming, and Matt Ridley's done great work in this. If we do want to take a harsh judgment on what we're going to do regarding the issue of carbon emissions, then everyone's going to need to accept that they're going to have to admit far lower standards of living than we enjoy at the moment. So it's a conversation for society to have whether they actually want to make that sacrifice. I'm not an expert on the data, so that's where I'm up to at the moment.
Okay, Richard.
Someone got in touch with the Scottish Family Party today. A dad had said his 9-year-old's daughter had come home from school in tears, saying that everyone was going to be dead in 10 years through global warming. So I think that's a real indoctrination issue in schools. My personal take, I don't think anyone could convince me either way about man-made global warming, whether it's definitely the case or it definitely isn't. I just think that the Earth's climate system is too complex and no one understands it well enough to actually be able to get a grip on this. And when people speak about it, as Anthony said, I don't trust academic establishments to be neutral. I think that the issue is very politicized, and the EU and the UN are driving a lot of the discussion and creating the official line. And when I look at the other official lines they take, I think they're virtually all wrong. So it doesn't fill me with confidence. Family party policy is that any measures taken to tackle climate change, they've got to be measured, costed, and they've got to be thought through instead of just like knee-jerk reaction to activists. So what happened in Scotland is the Scottish government declared a climate emergency because a bunch of kids gathered outside the Parliament. I mean, they should be just embarrassed that that's their level of thinking. That's what's driving government policy on the issue. So we certainly want to do away with that sort of nonsense and just try and get it onto a more rational discussion basis.
Okay. Does anyone have a burning question about an issue we haven't canvassed so far? Okay, sir.
Hello, my name is Peter. Scotland has a major problem with its deficit, which is unsustainable whether or not it becomes independent. So how would you, in your party, cut the deficit?
See. Okay, Richard, on Scotland's deficit.
Right, the Scottish Family Party's policy is the country shouldn't be running at a deficit unless there's some sort of crisis going on. So it needs to be eliminated pretty sharpish. How you do that goes into a lot of areas where we don't have policies. But if you imagine the Scottish Parliament is budget time, they're all talking about the various things. We would be the people who stood up and said, look, you're just borrowing, you're maxing out your borrowing again. You've got no plan to pay it back. What are you doing? This just doesn't make sense. And we think that contribution, when you've got your 6 minutes for your speech, just someone saying that would be really important, even if they haven't got the other things to say. I mean, one area where you could save instantly would be the sock puppet charities in the third sector, which is just mammoth in Scotland. Well, I find it quite fun sometimes. I just make up the names of organisations. You can just like put 3 random words together. Scottish Care Network, say. Go onto Google, it probably exists. There's an office of people and they've got a graphic designer, and so just cut the lot. And I think that would save, it's not like a massive percentage of the total Scottish budget, but it would be a good start in any case.
Right, okay. Anthony.
Right. I'm not responsible for the policy on this matter, but a central plank of our platform is to cut wasteful spending. Now, I think that needs to be paired with some other things, because when the economy is used to a certain amount of government money going into it, it experiences a contraction when the government stops printing money to put that in. In order to cushion the blow, we need to radically free the market, deregulate the marketplace so that it's easier for businesses to hire people, so that they have less expenses on red tape and they can pay people more to actually do jobs, creating things that help people. So we'd have to come with a raft of policies to liberalise the economy so that the blow from the injection of money into the economy would be cushioned.
Okay. Right. Does someone have another issue, an issue we haven't canvassed already? Chap at the back.
Hello, Rufus. Do you see a big or strong state as compatible with or opposed to a strong family, or neutral with regard to the family?
Right. Okay. Anthony.
Well, no one likes competition, and the state traditionally hasn't really liked competition with your religious affiliation or your family. So I would probably say that no, it's not necessarily incompatible, but I think the incentives are such that it would tend to certainly through history it seems to have undermined that relationship.
Richard.
I say in terms of big state, small state, I would look at it on an issue by issue basis. Do I think the state should be involved in this issue, this issue, this issue? When I do that, my overall conclusion puts me on the small state end of the spectrum, very definitely. Does big state interfere in family life? Very definitely. And if you look at communist ideology, which in various diluted forms influences a lot of left-wing thought, then they tend to be the big state side of the political spectrum. And I think that anti-family theme goes through it very clearly. And I've got a book about comments about the family by Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. And so many of the things, it's pretty similar to you'll hear Nicola Sturgeon or, well, virtually any of them saying in the Scottish Parliament. So that's part of a political ideology that I'm very definitely against. So, yeah, on the small state side.
Okay, Stephen.
I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a conflict in all cases, and I think family choice could be increased in education through a voucher system, for example, as opposed to the national curriculum. I'm broadly sympathetic to family autonomy. But obviously, I think, as is acknowledged, there are extreme cases where the public interest or the interests of the family members will require public intervention. Yeah, we would see the family as an important building block, and its autonomy should be strengthened, should be maintained and strengthened.
Okay. Right. Okay.
Joe from Maine again. I'd like to hear what would the panelists' views be on removing American and NATO troops from the Middle East?
Right. Now, whose turn is it to go first this time? Stephen? British and NATO troops out of the Middle East, where would you stand?
It would need to be looked at on a country-by-country basis. I believe we would tend to be sympathetic. I think that the level of understanding of these countries isn't great. It's not always. There seems to be an interest in destabilizing these countries, which, I mean, if you look at the debate in Syria, there was a time when we seemed to be attacking Assad and by implication supporting ISIS, or not ISIS, but ISIS by another name, and then the policy switched around. So it doesn't suggest that there's a great deal of independent thinking at the British level. The American level is somewhat different, but I'm not persuaded that they have a project that's going to accomplish good and that's realisable. It tends to have a destabilising effect. There's been a general thing in the Middle East of having sort of authoritarian secular governments, but one of the major things is the rise of Muslim Brotherhood, organised Muslim Brotherhood groups, which kind of are quite adept at presenting themselves as something other than they are. And I'm not sure that the military can impose order, but there are downsides to having a militaristic society. We wouldn't want it in our country, and nor would people as a default position want it in the Middle East. So I don't think the level of ideological understanding is typically such as to justify military intervention, given the cost in life.
Anthony?
Yeah. Our country has caused nothing but problems with its involvement in the Middle East, from taking out democratically elected leaders in countries like Iran, to supporting Saddam Hussein and then removing him from power, to training the Mujahideen to go up against the communists that then became Al-Qaeda. We need to stop spending money bombing people, creating resentment against us. I'm always reminded of a story from history in which Julius Caesar went during his invasions in Africa to a village and would kill everyone in that village and then bring the neighbouring chiefs to look at what he'd done so that they would surrender. He was succeeded, I believe, by Augustus Caesar, who coined the term "make peace or war." When he was making his invasions in Africa, he would go to one village and build an aqueduct and give them sewers, and then bring the chiefs from the neighbouring villages to look at the marvels that Rome had to offer, and they too would acquiesce. Now, I'm not saying that we should be going around building aqueducts, but our influence in the world should be positive. We should show what free market capitalism and the products of Western civilization are and how they advantage people, and we should influence the world that way, not through military force.
Well, have we not convinced the Chinese of the benefits of capitalism, but we've yet to convince them of the benefits of democracy?
We have not exactly shown ourselves to be a shining example of democracy in all cases yet, so maybe we can work on the project of becoming a better example in that respect too.
Okay, Richard.
The Middle East is very complex. I'm not an expert in it at all. I think you've got a lot of nations there that are quite dangerous and difficult and do need keeping in check. There are some nations that, if they could get away with it, would be aggressive to various of the neighbours. I think often in that area you're dealing with different groups. You've got the bad, the worst and the terrible, so it's quite difficult to get any sort of positive outcome. One of my greatest attractions to renewable energy, never see wind farms or whatever, is if we could free ourselves from dependence on oil and the Middle East stop being of this strategic importance. I think that would be a really positive thing for the world. And also some of the regimes there currently rely on being able to have oil wealth rather than developing a proper democracy, a proper economy. Then I think if they had to do that, I think that would take a lot of the heat out of the situation there and there'd be a much better future. So yeah, that's one of the best arguments for renewable energy as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
So you're in favour of wind farms?
Sorry?
You're in favour of wind farms?
Oh, for that reason, in moderation.
Okay, right.
Just a very quick one. Okay. This is to Stephen?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, there's this guy called Mark Curtis. Okay, I think comes from a different side of the political spectrum. Anyway, he wrote an excellent book called Secret Affairs, which is basically on the role of MI5 in conjunction with Mossad and the CIA, etc. Their role in actually, arming and training the Muslim Brotherhood across the Middle East and North Africa, especially in Egypt, but also in Syria, for example. There was famous attacks basically in Homs in 1980 something. I can't remember exactly what year. Okay, this was when the predecessor to Assad's dad, Assad Senior, basically is responsible for a massacre of several thousand people. And this is always cited as saying Assad is a really bad guy, we get rid of him. It's actually the British who trained what was then the Muslim Brotherhood to try to oust Assad back in the 1980s.
Right. I would resist that. Sorry.
What was the quick point?
Yeah, I thought it was only a quick point. Right. Okay, right. We'll have the last question, and it's going to...
Can I just respond to that?
Yeah, right. Can we respond to that?
I think we should possibly at least question or get away from the project of not giving these resurgent Islam its own agency. So I think no doubt we engage with these people, but they have their own project going back to the 1920s when they were founded. They have their own ideology. So I would question it. I haven't seen this book, but it sounds interesting. But I think certainly they have their own agency, their own agenda.
Right, very briefly.
If it's true, it should come as no surprise to anyone. We've backed radical Islam in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah,
they open up Wahhabi schools everywhere. We backed radical Islam when we intervened in Kosovo. Not only that, there was a case where in Syria the Pentagon was being found to fund one faction that was fighting against another faction funded by the CIA. And that was exposed in the media. So it really shouldn't surprise anyone if that is true. There is a book called The Devil's Game by a leftist cataloguing how the West has empowered radical Islam.
Right.
Okay, I won't have anything to say about this specific question, but just to conclude, help yourself to a booklet. We've got our policy booklet at the back and other leaflets. The Scottish Family Party, you can be what we call an associate member, which is someone who's a member of another party. You get 2 votes in Scotland, so why can't you be in 2 parties? There are membership forms there. And the other thing is that the venue is a bit more expensive than we budgeted for. So if you did want to chip in a bit, that would be appreciated. There's the black tray at the back. If you wanted to put a couple of pounds on, that would be great. That's entirely up to you. And thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.